The night Ethan Cole stopped at a roadside diner, he wasn't looking for anything except a warm cup of coffee and a few quiet minutes off the road. But the elderly woman across from him had trembling hands, eyes fixed on the door, and the unmistakable look of someone being hunted. She leaned across and whispered 4 words that changed everything. And without knowing her name, her story, or what she was carrying, he made a silent decision that would pull them both into something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and indifferent, while drumming against the tin overhang above the diner's entrance like it had somewhere better to be, but couldn't quite leave. It softened the edges of everything, the parking lot, the road signs, the distant tree line, until the whole world beyond the windows looked waterlogged and uncertain. The kind of evening that made people pull over, not because they planned to, but because the road felt less reliable than it had an hour ago. Inside, the Millbrook roadside diner was warm in the way that only old places manage to be. The kind of warmth that comes from decades of the same coffee pot running, the same vinyl booths absorbing years of conversation, the same ceiling fan turning slowly above a counter that had probably heard more honest confessions than most churches in the county. Yet the smell of the place was coffee and fried food and something faintly sweet. Apple pie, maybe, or just the memory of it baked into the walls. A jukebox in the corner played something slow and country that nobody was really listening to. 3 other customers sat spread across the room, a trucker at the counter nursing black coffee, an older couple sharing a slice of pie by the far window, and a teenage girl on her phone in the booth nearest the restrooms. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a practical ponytail and a pen tucked behind her ear, was refilling the trucker's cup and talking to him about something involving her brother-in-law's truck. Ethan Cole sat in the second booth from the back on the left side, positioned exactly where he always positioned himself in any room. Back to the wall, full sight line to the entrance, so secondary exit noted and memorized. It wasn't something he had to think about anymore, it was just how he existed in the world. He was 37, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet stillness that people often mistook for relaxation. It wasn't relaxation, it was control, the difference between a coiled spring and a loose wire. His jacket was plain, dark olive, practical. His hands rested on the table without fidgeting. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, half full, and a menu he hadn't touched. Rex lay on the floor beside him, a Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of dark amber and black, ears sharp and angled forward even now, even in the warm quiet of the diner. He was technically off-duty, wearing a civilian vest rather than his tactical gear, but Rex didn't really understand the concept of off-duty. His dark eyes scanned the room in slow, systematic sweeps, the same way Ethan's did. They had been partners long enough that their rhythms matched almost without effort. Ethan had stopped here because it was the next exit with a food option and because he'd been on the road for 6 hours and Rex needed water. He wasn't expecting anything from this evening. That was usually when something happened. He noticed the woman in the booth across from him the way he noticed everything, quietly, without staring, in pieces. She was in her late 70s, black, with silver-white hair pinned up neatly beneath a soft felt hat the color of deep burgundy. She wore a long coat that was a size too large for her, the kind of coat that had probably belonged to someone else at some point. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, and she was stirring it. Slowly, continuously, the kind of stirring that had nothing to do with the coffee. Her eyes were what told him everything. They kept drifting to the door, not the casual glance of someone waiting for a friend, not the idle habit of people watching. These were measured, repeated checks, calculated intervals, her gaze returning to the entrance and holding there for just a half-second longer than was natural, as if she were measuring something, as if she were timing something. Ethan recognized that look. He had worn it himself, in other rooms, in other countries. It was the look of someone who knew they were being looked for. He didn't stare at her. He didn't look directly. He simply noted it and held it, the same way he held everything that seemed wrong, keeping it in a corner of his awareness while the rest of him appeared to do nothing. Yet the door opened, not with urgency. That was the first thing Ethan clocked. The deliberate casualness of it, the way the man stepped inside and paused, letting his gaze move across the room slowly, as if he were simply deciding where to sit. He was dressed well. Dark suit, no tie, collar buttoned just enough to look intentional. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, average height, the kind of face that was designed to be forgettable. And that, more than anything else, was what told Ethan this man was not here for a meal. Forgettable faces in well-pressed suits didn't stop at highway diners on rainy Tuesday evenings by accident. The man's eyes moved across the room with the practiced efficiency of someone running a sweep. Over the trucker, over the couple, over the teenager. And then, just for a fraction longer than everything else, over the woman in the burgundy hat. Rex's ears shifted. A subtle thing, barely visible, but Ethan felt it, the slight tension traveling through the dog's body like a low current. Rex hadn't made a sound. He didn't need to. The signal was enough. Something is wrong here. Ethan kept his eyes on his coffee. The woman across from him had gone very still. The spoon stopped moving in her cup. Her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, and she lowered her gaze to the table, the way people do when they're trying to disappear without moving. Then she did something Ethan hadn't expected. She looked at him. Not the glancing, accidental eye contact of strangers in a shared space. She looked at him directly, deliberately, and what he saw in her face wasn't just fear. It was a decision being made. Right there, in real time, the kind of decision that comes when someone runs out of every other option. She leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between their booths by just a few inches, and when she spoke, it was barely above a breath, the words shaped more by her lips than by any real sound. "Please, pretend to be my grandson." Ethan didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't let a single thing cross his face that shouldn't be there. He sat with those words for exactly 1.5 seconds, long enough to assess, not long enough to hesitate, and then he shifted. He moved his coffee cup to her side of the table. He slid his arm along the back of the booth, naturally, the way someone does when they're settling in with family. He turned his body just slightly toward her and let a slow, easy smile find his face, and when he spoke at normal volume, warm, relaxed, the kind of voice that carried. "Grandma, come on, you barely touched your coffee. You always do this. Order it and then let it go cold." He said it like he'd said it 100 times before. The woman, Lillian, though he didn't know her name yet, blinked once. And then something shifted in her posture, not full relief, not calm, but the particular steadying that happens when someone grabs something solid in rough water. She lifted her cup and took a small sip, her hand still trembling slightly. "You know how I am," she said, her voice barely above a murmur, finding the rhythm of the scene he'd handed her. "Always letting things get cold." Rex hadn't moved from his position, but Ethan could feel the change in him, alert now in a different way. Still, controlled, but locked in. The dog had processed the shift in the situation the same moment Ethan had. Ethan didn't look directly at the suited man. He used the window to his left instead, the rain-blurred glass that caught just enough of the diner's interior light to serve as a dim mirror. He tracked the man's movements in it without appearing to track anything at all. The man had paused near the hostess stand. He was speaking to no one. He wasn't reaching for a menu. His eyes hadn't left the booth where Lillian sat. Then he started walking toward them. Not hurrying. Measured, easy steps, each one placed with the deliberate calm of someone who knows they hold the advantage. He stopped beside their booth and rested one hand loosely on the back of the empty seat across from them, and he smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors, wide enough to seem friendly, never reaching the eyes. "Evening, folks. Sorry to bother you." His voice was smooth, unhurried. "Just checking. Is everything all right? I thought I recognized this lovely lady from somewhere." His gaze moved to Lillian, and it stayed there. Ethan looked up from his coffee like a man mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. "Yeah, we're good, thanks. Just catching up. Haven't seen my grandmother in a few months. You know how it goes." He let just enough warmth into his tone to make it sound completely real, and just enough weight beneath it to make the message clear. "This conversation is done." The man held his smile. His eyes stayed on Lillian a beat too long. "Of course, enjoy your evening." He straightened and glanced once at Rex, who had not moved, but whose eyes were fixed on him with the absolute unblinking certainty of something that has already made its calculations. And then he turned and walked toward the other side of the diner. He chose a booth with a clean sight line to theirs. Lillian exhaled, barely audible, and Ethan reached across the table and rested his hand over hers without ceremony. It was a practical gesture. Anyone watching would see a grandson offering comfort. It was also how he felt the tremor running through her fingers, and how he steadied her without making a scene of it. "Don't look at him," he said quietly, keeping his voice beneath the ambient noise of the diner. "Just keep looking at me. Talk like we're having a normal conversation." "I don't know how much time we have," she whispered. "Then start talking." She took a breath. "My name is Lillian Brooks. I'm 78 years old, and I have been followed for the better part of 6 months." She paused, composing herself. "I tried going to the police twice. The first time, they told me I was imagining things. The second time, the officer I spoke to, I saw him again the next week, standing outside my building." She looked down at her hands. "I stopped going to the police after that." Ethan said nothing. He let her continue. "My son passed away 14 months ago. He was 49. They told me it was a heart attack." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Marcus was healthy. He ran 5 miles every morning. He didn't have heart problems." She looked up at Ethan then. "But I couldn't prove anything. I still can't. What I could do was what he asked me to do before all of this started, before he died, which was keep something safe for him. Something he said I should never, under any circumstances, give to anyone who came asking for it." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "What did he give you?" "I'll tell you, but not yet." Her eyes flicked to the booth where the suited man sat, just briefly, involuntarily. "If he knows I'm alone, I won't make it out of here." Ethan looked at her. Just once, fully, taking in the clarity behind the fear, the clear eyes, the steady voice working hard to stay steady, the quiet dignity of a woman who had held something enormous for a very long time and hadn't broken under it. He gave a single slight nod. No words. It wasn't a promise made lightly, but it was made. And the suited man ordered coffee he wasn't going to drink. Ethan tracked it in the window reflection, watched the man wave down the waitress, accept the cup, wrap both hands around it without lifting it once. He had arranged himself in the booth at an angle that kept Lillian in his sightline while appearing, to anyone glancing casually, to simply be a man resting after a drive. It was competent positioning, practiced, the kind of thing you didn't learn from watching crime dramas. The rain picked up outside, tapping harder against the glass, and the trucker at the counter paid his bill and left, which meant the diner was down to 4 people and 1 very attentive dog. Ethan kept the conversation alive at a surface level, asking Lillian about her trip, commenting on the weather, filling the air between them with the kind of ordinary noise that grandsons and grandmothers fill air with. Lillian, to her considerable credit, matched him. She mentioned a garden she kept, a television program she liked, the fact that the coffee here was better than she'd expected. Her voice barely wavered. But beneath all of it, they were both watching. The man shifted in his seat. Rex moved first, not dramatically, just a slow repositioning, his chin lifting slightly off his front paws, his focus sharpening. And then, from somewhere low in his chest, came a sound that was barely a sound at all. A sustained exhale with the faintest edge of a growl threaded through it. Not aggressive, not a warning bark, the kind of sound that only happened when Rex had made a definitive assessment of something and wanted Ethan to know about it. The suited man had heard it. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the coffee cup. Ethan didn't acknowledge Rex outwardly. He just felt the confirmation land and noted it. "You doing okay?" he asked Lillian, still in the warm register of the performance they were running. She said, lifting her coffee cup. "Just tired from the drive." The man across the room hadn't made another move toward them. He seemed to be recalculating. The sudden addition of a large, calm, clearly capable man and an obviously trained dog had disrupted whatever script he'd walked in with. He wasn't rattled, but he was reassessing. Ethan kept the pressure off him. The worst thing he could do right now was make the man feel cornered. Cornered people made abrupt choices. He leaned slightly toward Lillian. "Tell me more about what you've been holding. You said Marcus gave you something before he passed. What was it?" Lillian set her cup down. When she spoke now, she was quiet enough that he had to concentrate to hear her beneath the rain. "My son worked for a government contractor. That's how it was always explained. Logistics, infrastructure, support work for government programs. He traveled constantly. He couldn't always tell me where, and I learned not to ask too many questions because the answers I got were never complete anyway." She paused. Marcus was private, not cold. Never cold, he called every Sunday without fail, but private about his work in a way that I understood meant there were things he couldn't share. Ethan nodded. He recognized the outline of it immediately. The deliberately vague job description, the frequent travel, the partial information given to family. He'd had that conversation from the other side of it enough times to know what the outline usually meant. After he passed, a man came to my door, maybe 3 weeks after the funeral. Lillian's voice dropped further. He was polite, said he was from Marcus's employer, that there might be some personal effects of Marcus's that had inadvertently made their way to me, and they just needed to collect them. Very kind, very smooth. She shook her head. I told him I didn't have anything, which was true. At the time, I didn't know I had anything. He left. Then another man came. She straightened slightly. That one wasn't as polite. He asked the same questions, but the way he asked them was different. He was looking around my apartment while we talked. Not obviously, but I noticed. My son taught me to notice. Her eyes went distant for a moment. Marcus used to play this game with me when he visited. He called it the room game. He'd walk in somewhere new and then tell me 5 things other people had missed. He did it for years. I used to think it was just how he was. I understand now that he was teaching me. Ethan filed that away. Smart man. Thoughtful man. Did they search your home? Yes. She said it simply, without drama. I came back one afternoon and things were arranged incorrectly. A person who has lived in the same space for 20 years knows where everything belongs. 3 things in my kitchen were moved. The books in my hallway shelf were not in the same order. My bedroom closet, the boxes on the top shelf were shifted. Did they find anything? No. And for the first time since the conversation had started, something close to quiet satisfaction moved through her expression. Because Marcus didn't give me something obvious. He didn't send a package or leave something at my apartment while I was home. He gave it to me 2 years ago at Christmas, tucked inside a gift, and he said nothing about it except that I should keep it close and that it mattered. Ethan waited. Lillian reached up slowly and touched the collar of her coat, just below the second button, where a small shape pressed against the fabric from inside. A locket. She didn't pull it out. Not here, not with the suited man still in his booth. But the gesture was enough. "A key," she said softly. "Small, old-looking?"
"It's inside the locket. I wear it every day, and I have worn it every day since he gave it to me, because Marcus asked me to keep it close, and because whatever it opens, he clearly believed it was worth protecting." Ethan absorbed this without reacting. A key. Not documents, not a drive, not a photograph. A physical key, which meant a physical lock, somewhere. Something that required presence, not just data. Which also meant that whatever was on the other end of that key was either too sensitive to transmit or too important to exist only in digital form. Outside, through the rain-blurred window, a beam of headlights swept slowly across the parking lot and held. It wasn't moving. Ethan kept his expression exactly where it was. "Don't look toward the parking lot," he said quietly. "How long has that SUV been sitting out there?" Lillian's breath caught. "I don't know. I didn't come in through that side." He shifted his gaze to the window reflection, adjusting the angle subtly, and picked up what he needed. A dark vehicle, large, parked at the lot's edge facing the building. Engine running, judging by the faint exhaust he could see, curling upward in the wet air. 2 shapes in the front seats. Neither of them had moved since the vehicle arrived. 3 people, 1 inside, 2 outside. This wasn't a tail. This was a net. He had kept his phone face down on the seat beside him, and now he picked it up with the unhurried gesture of someone checking a notification, and typed without looking directly at the screen. 12 words to a number he hadn't contacted in over 2 years. But he used the shorthand they'd established for situations that couldn't be fully explained. It translated roughly to active threat, civilian involved, possible covert origin. Confirm? He didn't know if he'd get an answer tonight. He sent it anyway. Lillian was watching him. "You're not what I expected," she said softly, with a careful quality to the words. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd get up and leave." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Most people would have." "I know." She held his gaze. "That's why I asked you. I watched you for 15 minutes before that man came in. I watched how you sat, how your dog watched the room. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing, but I understood that you were someone who would know what to do." She paused. "I was right, wasn't I?" He didn't answer that directly. "Please tell me about the days leading up to tonight. Why were you at this diner? Were you going somewhere?" "I was trying to." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup again. "A woman I trusted, a neighbor, someone I've known for years, told me 2 days ago that a man had been asking about me in the building, what I looked like, what my routine was, when I was usually home." Lillian's mouth tightened. That was enough. I packed what I needed, and I left before sunrise. I have been driving since. "Where were you heading?" "I don't know exactly. Away." She exhaled. "That sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Ethan said. "Away is sometimes the only reasonable destination." He paused. "How did they find you here?" "I used my card at the gas station 2 exits back. I didn't think—" She stopped herself. "I should have thought. Marcus told me once that a card swipe was a location stamp. I should have remembered." She'd been running on instinct and exhaustion, not preparation. It happened. It wasn't a failing. It was just reality. "What about family?" Ethan asked. "Anyone you could have gone to?" "Marcus was my only child. My husband passed 11 years ago. I have a sister in Atlanta, but she has her own health troubles, and I won't put this near her." The finality in her voice closed that line of conversation gently but completely.
I am on my own with this, or I was. The man in the suit shifted again in his booth. Ethan saw it in the reflection, not standing, not moving toward them, but making a different kind of adjustment. The small movement of someone signaling something or checking something. His hand had gone beneath the table. "We're going to leave," Ethan said. His voice stayed even and quiet. "Not yet. In about 3 minutes. We're going to finish the last of our coffee like people who just had a nice visit, and then I'm going to help you into your coat because that's what grandsons do, and we're going to walk to the door at a normal pace." "And the men outside?" "I know where they are. I know what they're watching." He glanced at Rex, who was already repositioning slightly, reading the shift in Ethan's body language, and aligning himself with what was coming next. "We'll take the left side of the lot, not the right. My truck is toward the back." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "You're very calm." "I'm always calm," Ethan said. "Does it help?" "Yes." He picked up his coffee and finished it. "Drink the rest of yours. Slowly." She did. And while she did, Ethan paid the bill, folded the receipt, tucked it away like a man without a care in the world, and when the time came, he stood and offered his hand to help her from the booth. "Come on, Grandma, long drive ahead." Lillian took his hand. Her grip was stronger than he'd expected. They moved toward the exit at exactly the right pace, not fast enough to look urgent, not slow enough to look reluctant. Rex stayed precisely at Ethan's left side, his movement fluid and controlled, his eyes sweeping ahead. The suited man watched them from his booth. He didn't stand, not yet. But as the door swung closed behind them and the rain hit cold and immediate, Ethan heard, beneath the sound of the downpour, the subtle creak of a vinyl booth seat taking a sudden release of weight. He was up. Ethan didn't slow his pace, and he kept Lillian's arm in his and spoke without turning his head. "Don't look back. Don't slow down. Trust me." "I already do," Lillian said quietly. And they walked into the rain together, a woman in a burgundy hat holding a locket she didn't yet fully understand, a man who had stepped into a role that was supposed to last 5 minutes, a dog who had already decided what kind of night this was going to be. The rain hit Ethan's face, and he didn't flinch. The cold was grounding, immediate, and he used it. Let it sharpen the edges of everything around him, the layout of the parking lot, the precise angle of the SUV's headlights, the sound of wet gravel shifting somewhere off to the right. His hand stayed at Lillian's elbow, steady, guiding without rushing. And he kept his body between her and the direction of the vehicle sitting at the lot's edge. Rex moved without instruction, dropping a half step behind and to the right, the position that gave him the widest coverage angle without breaking from the group. He didn't pull or surge. He didn't growl or snap at shadows. He simply was where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there, the way he always was when it mattered. Behind them, the diner door opened. The sound of it was soft against the rain, but Ethan caught it. Footsteps followed, not running, not yet, but purposeful. The suited man giving up the last pretense of having been there for coffee. Rex's ears pressed forward, and Ethan Cole, who had not been looking for a mission tonight, felt the familiar lock of focus settle into place, sharp, clean, absolute. The same feeling that had carried him through a dozen operations in places that didn't officially exist, in situations that were never supposed to happen. The world around him clarified. Sound sharpened. Options arranged themselves in order of viability. He didn't know yet what Lillian's son had left behind. He didn't know what the key unlocked, what Black Harbor meant, what the men in the SUV had been told to retrieve or by whom. He had fragments and instinct and a woman walking beside him who had been carrying this alone for over a year. It was enough to move on. "My truck is the dark gray one, parked at the far end of the row," he said quietly. "I see it," Lillian said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Good. Keep moving. Whatever Lillian Brooks had been carrying alone for 14 months, she was no longer carrying it alone. Not tonight. Not anymore. The parking lot was slick and dark, the rain turning every surface into a mirror that threw back broken pieces of light. Ethan moved Lillian along the left side of the building, keeping the diner's exterior wall close on their right, using it as cover from the SUV's sight line. Behind them, the suited man had pushed through the diner door. He wasn't running. Men like him rarely ran until they had to, but his footsteps on the wet gravel were deliberate and closing. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. Rex had already clocked the distance and adjusted his position to the rear right, his body angled like a compass needle that had found its north. His ears were fully forward, rotating slightly with every sound that mattered and filtering out every sound that didn't. "Keep your head forward," Ethan said quietly. "Don't change your pace." "I'm not," Lillian said, and she wasn't. Whatever fear was moving through her, she was keeping it internal, channeling it into something that looked from the outside like composure. He respected that more than he let on. His truck was a dark gray pickup, 8 years old and unexceptional by design, parked at the far end of the lot's back row. He'd backed it in, always backed in every parking lot every time, because the habit had saved him twice that he could count and probably more times that he couldn't. The cab was angled to allow a forward exit in any direction without needing to swing wide or reverse blind. 30 feet away. 20. He had the key in his hand already, no fumbling, no searching pockets. And when they reached it, he opened the passenger side first, helped Lillian up with a firm, steady hand at her elbow, and closed the door quietly in one fluid motion before moving around to his side. Rex was in the back before Ethan's door was fully shut. He'd learned over years of working together exactly when a situation called for speed and exactly when it called for silence, and tonight he gave Ethan both without being asked. He started the engine and pulled out slowly, keeping the RPMs low, letting the truck roll rather than accelerate. No tire spin, no urgency, just a vehicle leaving a parking lot at the natural pace of someone finished with dinner. He watched the mirrors. The suited man had reached the edge of the lot and stopped, watching them, his phone already at his ear. The SUV engine came to life at the far end of the lot. "They're moving," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lillian. He turned onto the service road that ran beside the diner rather than taking the main exit ramp back to the highway. The service road was narrow and unlit and curved around the back of a fuel depot and a row of storage units before reconnecting to a secondary road that ran parallel to the highway for about a mile. "Where are we going?" Lillian asked. "Away from the highway. They'll expect the highway." He kept his eyes moving. Mirrors, road ahead, mirrors again. "They've got a faster vehicle and probably better comms than I currently have. I need distance and cover before I can work with that." Lillian nodded, and he noticed she'd pulled her coat tighter around herself, one hand pressed flat against her chest, over the locket, without seeming to realize she was doing it. The SUV swung out of the lot and took the main exit. Ethan watched its headlights in the mirror, tracking it until the service road curved and the tree line broke the sight line. He had maybe 90 seconds before they figured out he hadn't taken the highway. He drove without speaking for 2 minutes, taking turns that weren't signposted, following the grid of secondary roads he'd noted when he first pulled into the area. The kind of passive mapping that had become as automatic as breathing after enough years of operating in places where the difference between a known road and an unknown one was the difference between coming home and not. The rain came heavier now, the windshield wipers working steadily, and the world outside narrowed to the reach of his headlights. He turned them off. Lillian said nothing. She gripped the door handle once and then released it. He drove by memory and by the faint ambient light of the sky for another 30 seconds, then pulled off the road entirely onto a gravel service track that ran between two darkened commercial properties, what looked like a wholesale supplier and a closed repair garage. He cut the engine. Silence. Rain on the roof. Rex breathing steadily in the back. 60 seconds passed. No headlights swept the road they'd come from. Ethan turned the engine back on, headlights still off, and reversed further into the track until the truck was fully obscured from the road by the garage's corner wall. "Okay," he said. "We have a few minutes. Talk to me." Lillian exhaled. "What do you need to know?" "Everything you haven't told me yet." She was quiet for a moment, gathering herself. Then she reached up to the collar of her coat and, carefully, drew out the locket. It was small, oval-shaped, old gold that had softened to the color of warm brass, with a fine chain that had been repaired at least once. She didn't open it, just held it in her palm, and let him see it. "Marcus gave me this 2 Christmases before he died," she said. "He told me to wear it every day. He said if I ever needed help and he wasn't there, and someone came who I felt I could trust, truly trust, I should show them what was inside." She paused. "I don't show most people, but you're showing me. I'm showing you." She opened it. Inside, where a photograph or a keepsake might normally sit, there was a small key, thin, flat, roughly cut from what looked like hardened steel, with a series of notches along its blade that weren't random. Not a standard key, something custom, something made for a specific lock in a specific place. Ethan studied it without touching it. "He never told you what it opened?" "No. He told me only that it was important, that the wrong people would want it, and that if I ever found myself being pressured to give it up, by anyone, for any reason, I should assume that person was one of the wrong people." She closed the locket. He was very clear about that part. He said to me, "Mom, if someone comes with a badge, with credentials, with paperwork, that means nothing. The key stays hidden." Ethan sat with that. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the main road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the rain, and then the darkness closed back in. "Your son didn't work in logistics," Ethan said quietly. "I know that now." Lillian's voice was steady. "I think I suspected it for years and chose not to look directly at it. He was a good man. Whatever he was involved in, he was a good man who was trying to do something right with it. I have to believe that." "What was his full name?" "Marcus Darnell Brooks." Ethan filed it. He'd run it when he had a secure connection. He checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. He let another 30 seconds pass, then eased the truck back onto the service track and moved quietly toward the secondary road. He'd been mapping the area in his head since they left the diner, and there was an option. Not ideal, but workable. An industrial block about a mile north, the kind of area that showed up as occupied on satellite imagery, but was largely inactive at night. Older buildings, multiple access points. Enough structural coverage to work from if things escalated. They were 3 blocks away when the SUV reappeared, not behind them. Ahead, cutting across an intersection to the right, its lights sweeping the cross street. It stopped, then reversed. It had seen them. "Hold on," Ethan said. He turned immediately, taking a left that put a row of buildings between them, and then another left, doubling back briefly before cutting through what turned out to be a loading area between 2 warehouses, gravel, unlit, barely wide enough for the truck. Rex braced in the back without a sound. Ethan came out the other side of the loading area onto a narrow access road and made a right, pushing north without headlights, trusting the ambient light and his own memory of the grid. Lillian kept her breathing controlled. He could hear her working at it. The industrial block appeared on the left, a cluster of single-story and 2-story structures, chain-link perimeter with a gate standing open, a faded sign for a company that had probably closed a decade ago. He turned in, drove slowly past the first building, and parked behind the second, where the truck was invisible from the access road. "Out," he said. "Bring only what you need." They moved on foot across the wet gravel to a side entrance of the second building, a metal door, padlocked, which Ethan examined for approximately 4 seconds before making a quiet decision that the lock was old enough to be reasoned with. He didn't force it dramatically. He applied pressure at a specific point, and the mechanism gave way with a dull click. Inside was dry and smelled of machine oil and old wood, the particular smell of industrial spaces that had been shut down long enough for the work to leave but not long enough for the building to forget it. Some kind of former machine shop, equipment long since removed, probably sold off piece by piece when the business folded, but the bones of the workspace still there. Mounting brackets along one wall where something heavy had once been bolted. A workbench along the far side, stripped bare. High ceilings with exposed joists. Concrete floors stained in faint geometric patterns where machines had stood for years. A row of narrow windows up near the roofline, set close to the ceiling, let in just enough ambient light from the rain-gray sky to navigate by without risking a flashlight. Rex entered last, pausing at the threshold to read the air before stepping fully inside. Then he began his sweep, a systematic circuit of the perimeter, nose working low along the base of the walls, moving with the unhurried efficiency of an animal that had done this in far more dangerous spaces than an abandoned machine shop in a small town in the rain. He checked each corner fully. He paused twice, once near the loading bay and once near a gap in the interior wall that turned out to be a sealed electrical access panel, before continuing. When he completed the circuit, he returned to Ethan's side and sat. Clear. Ethan exhaled once, one controlled breath, and looked at Lillian. "They didn't search this building on the way in," he said. "We have time, but not a lot of it. They'll expand the search radius." He pulled the phone from his pocket and checked it. Still no reply from his contact. And he sent a second message, shorter, more direct. Then he looked up. "Tell me the last thing, the thing you were holding back." Lillian looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus called me 3 days before he died. It was late, past 11, and his voice was different, not frightened, but careful. He said, 'Mom, if anything happens to me, don't trust anyone who comes looking for the key, not even if they show a badge. Not even if they say they knew me.' And then he said," She stopped, swallowed. He said, "This is bigger than law enforcement. That's all I can tell you." The words sat in the dark space between them. Ethan turned them over slowly. Not random crime, not rogue actors. Something that had law enforcement either compromised or bypassed entirely. Which meant the men outside weren't just dangerous, they were protected, and whatever the key unlocked was the reason they'd never stop. Outside, somewhere 2 or 3 blocks east, a car moved slowly through the rain. Rex's head turned toward the wall. Ethan positioned them at the interior wall, away from the windows, and spent 30 seconds building a mental layout of the building. Entry points, structural cover, sight lines, exit options. 2 doors at ground level, both metal. 3 possible window entry points, all narrow and elevated, which ruled out anything fast. 1 loading bay shutter at the far end, locked from inside by a drop bar. The best defensive position in the room was the far corner behind a row of old metal shelving units, heavy gauge, bolted to the wall. He moved Lillian there without explaining the geometry of it. She went without asking for an explanation. Rex settled beside her, and Ethan took a position near the side entrance, close enough to the wall that his silhouette wouldn't be visible through the gap beneath the door. He checked his phone again. This time, there was a reply. 3 words. "Call me. Secure." He didn't have a secure line on him, not in the traditional sense. But he had a workaround, an app that bounced through enough relay points to make interception impractical for anyone without significant resources. He pulled it up and dialed. The call connected on the second ring. "It's Cole." He kept his voice low and flat. Just 2 words, nothing more. The man on the other end would know who it was regardless. The voice on the other end was older, unhurried, and carrying the particular texture of someone who had spent decades speaking carefully in situations where careless words had real consequences. There was a background hiss on the line, the relay points working, distance being manufactured between the call and any record of it. "I got your messages, both of them. Where are you?" "Doesn't matter yet. I have a civilian, woman, late 70s. Her son was Marcus Brooks, worked covert logistics, probably as a silent handler. He's dead, 14 months ago, ruled natural causes." She's been sitting on a physical access key for something classified, and she's been actively pursued for the last 6 months by what looks like a coordinated retrieval operation. Tonight it escalated to a 3-person net, 1 inside, 2 on vehicle support. They tracked her by card use, and they moved fast once they had her location. This isn't improvised. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone processing new information. The particular weighted silence of someone who already knows something and is deciding, carefully and deliberately, how much of it to confirm. "Say the name again," the voice said. "Marcus Brooks." Another pause. Longer this time. He heard the man on the other end of the line shift. A small sound, a breath changed, and Ethan recognized it as the sound of someone recalibrating what they were willing to say. "Cole." The voice was quieter now, the unhurried quality replaced by something more careful. "If it's what I think it is, you need to disappear tonight. Don't use your card. Don't use a registered vehicle past the next hour. And don't contact me again on a line that can be tied to your name." "I need more than that." "I know, I can't give it to you right now." A long beat, then just, "Be very careful who you trust on this one. That's all I can say to you right now." The call ended. Ethan stood with the phone in his hand for 3 full seconds, looking at the blank screen. Then he put it away. He looked across the dark space to where Lillian sat behind the shelving with Rex pressed against her side, the dog alert, but still. Disappear. That was the word his contact had used. Not be careful, not watch your back. Disappear. Which meant whoever was running this operation had reach. Real reach, the kind that didn't stop at jurisdictions or department lines. He moved back toward Lillian. "How are you doing?" "I've been better," she said, it with a dryness that surprised him enough that he almost smiled. "We're going to need to move again soon. Different vehicle, different direction." He crouched to her level, keeping his voice even. "I'm going to get you through this, but I need you to trust that some of the decisions I make will look strange from the outside." "Most of them have already looked strange," she said. "I'm still here." He nodded. Then the side door exploded inward. Not a knock, not a warning. The metal door swung wide and hard, the old frame giving way under a single decisive kick, and 2 figures came through in fast succession, moving low, spreading immediately left and right to break the silhouette and deny a clean target. Professional entry, practiced spacing, no hesitation. Ethan was already moving before the door fully opened. He'd been positioned close enough to it that the man coming through the left had to clear the doorframe before he had a workable angle, a gap of maybe a second, maybe less. In that gap, Ethan moved. Not toward the center of the room, which was the instinctive direction, but into the door itself, cutting the angle, getting inside the man's reach before any weapon could be effectively presented. What followed was not dramatic. It was quick, specific, and quiet. Controlled force applied to the right points in the right sequence, the kind of thing that looked like nothing from a distance but ended with one man on the concrete floor and staying there, breathing but not going anywhere soon. The whole sequence took less than 5 seconds and made less noise than the door opening had. The second man had cleared right and was sweeping the room. He trying to locate a target in the low light. He was good. He moved with discipline.
kept his back angles covered, didn't crowd the center. But the room was dark and unfamiliar, and Ethan had been in it long enough to know every shadow in it. He moved along the far wall, keeping below the window line, letting the man's own momentum carry him past the angle where he'd have been useful. The man reached the center of the room, still sweeping left, which put his back to the shelving unit. Rex made the decision himself. He moved from beside Lillian in complete silence. No bark, no warning, nothing telegraphed to the room, and came in from the man's right with the focused, controlled certainty of a dog who had trained for exactly this. He hit the man's forearm at the moment it mattered most, and the grip locked. The man went down hard, and the object in his hand, a tactical baton, not a firearm, skidded across the concrete floor and came to rest against the far wall. He shouted once before the shock overtook the instinct for noise. Ethan was across the room in 4 steps, and it was over. Rex released on a single quiet word, stepped back 2 paces, and returned to a position beside Lillian without being directed there. Ethan secured both men efficiently and then crouched over the second, the one Rex had taken down, and that was when he saw it. The man's jacket had pulled back in the fall, and clipped to his belt, partially exposed, was a communications unit. Not commercial, not standard police issue in any department Ethan was familiar with. The casing was matte black, compact and dense, with a proprietary connector port along the bottom edge and a small status light, pulsing a slow, steady amber on the face. He'd seen that design lineage before. He knew where it came from. Government-issued equipment, possibly surplus, possibly contracted out, possibly something murkier. But the origin was unmistakable to anyone who had carried similar gear in rooms that didn't make it onto official reports. Ethan unclipped it without touching the control surface and slipped it carefully into his inside jacket pocket. He looked at the first man, now conscious but not going anywhere, and studied his face. Mid-40s, fit, close-cropped hair, the particular blankness of expression that came from training rather than temperament, not someone who'd been hired off the street, someone who'd been placed. "We need to go," Ethan said, standing. Lillian had already risen to her feet. She was looking at the 2 men on the floor, and her expression was something he couldn't fully name. Not shock, not satisfaction, something in between. The expression of someone who had spent 6 months being afraid of exactly this and had now seen it made concrete and survivable. "Are they—" she started. "They're fine," Ethan said. "Inconvenienced?" He moved to the loading bay shutter at the far end, lifted the drop bar, and raised it by hand, slowly, controlling the noise. Beyond it was a service alley running behind the building, unlit, with a chain-link fence at the far end and enough shadow to move through cleanly. Rex passed through first, clearing the alley the same way he'd cleared the building. He stopped at the mouth and looked back. Clear. They moved. The rain had eased slightly, still falling, but no longer the relentless drumming of earlier, more of a steady gray mist that softened sound and reduced visibility equally. That worked for them. Ethan found an older model sedan 2 blocks away, parked on a quiet side street in front of a darkened house with no lights on and a driveway that held a different car, suggesting whoever the sedan belonged to, they weren't relying on it tonight. He looked at it for 3 seconds and kept walking. Too light in color, too visible under the street lamps. Instead, he moved past it to a vehicle parked another half-block down, a dark blue van with contractor markings along the side panel. The kind of van that sat on working-class streets at all hours without attracting a second glance because it looked like it belonged everywhere and nowhere specifically. He spent 40 seconds with the door before it opened cleanly, another 40, and the engine turned over on the first attempt. He let it idle for a moment, listening, before pulling away from the curb with his lights off. Lillian settled into the passenger seat without a word. Rex moved into the back and lay down, chin on his paws, eyes tracking the rear window. 2 blocks of silence. 3.
As they moved further from the industrial block, putting distance between themselves and whatever was happening back at the machine shop, the tightness in Ethan's chest eased by a single degree. Not relief, he didn't allow himself relief yet, but the workable calm that came from having survived one stage and having a vehicle under him and a direction to move in. He reached into his jacket and retrieved the communications unit. The amber pulse was still going, steady, slow, patient. He studied the face of it for a moment, reading the details without pressing anything. The amber light meant it was connected to something, active on a network, which meant that somewhere, right now, something was receiving its location. He held the power button down for a full 5 seconds. The amber light faded and went dark. Then he turned it over and read the classification stamp embossed into the underside of the casing. Small letters, precise. He pressed into the matte black surface with the kind of permanence that suggested whoever ordered the equipment had intended the marking as a record, not a warning. His jaw tightened slightly. He knew the office code. He'd seen it on gear in rooms he wasn't supposed to have been in, attached to operations that officially didn't exist. The stamp didn't tell him who specifically had authorized tonight's operation, but it told him enough about the architecture of the authorization to understand why his contact had used the word disappear rather than anything softer. "What does it say?" Lillian asked quietly. She had been watching his face since he took the unit out, reading it the way someone reads a person when words aren't available yet. He set the unit on the seat between them. "It means the people who came through that door tonight aren't freelancers," he said. "This equipment has a chain of custody that doesn't come from nowhere. Someone with real authority touched this operation." Lillian absorbed that slowly. She didn't react with panic. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything tonight, with the measured gravity of someone who had been preparing in some quiet corner of themselves for confirmation of what they already suspected. "You mean someone in authority sent them," she said. "Someone with access to this level of equipment authorized this operation," he said, and she heard the distinction. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower than it had been all evening, carrying something heavier than fear. "I didn't know," she said softly. "Whatever Marcus got involved in, I didn't know it was this serious. I just kept the key because he asked me to. That's all I did." "I know," Ethan said. "He was my son." She said it plainly, like a fact she needed to place somewhere solid. "Whatever he was, whatever any of this is, he was my son first." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He had no answer for that was worth offering, so he didn't offer one. He just drove. After another moment, he reached down and turned the communications unit over in his hand one more time, looking at the classification stamp. He'd run the office code when he had the means to do it without leaving a trail. For now, it sat between them on the seat like a small dark question mark. He looked at the road ahead, then back at the unit. "This isn't about what you know anymore," he said quietly. "It's about what they think you have." Lillian reached up and pressed her hand flat against the locket beneath her coat. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The van moved through the misting rain, headlights cutting a narrow path through the dark. Rex lay in the back with his head up and his eyes open, watching the road behind them through the rear window, steady and certain, the same as he always was. Somewhere ahead of them, connected to a small key inside a worn brass locket, was the reason all of this had started. And for the first time tonight, Ethan Cole allowed himself to think past survival, to think about what came next and what reaching it would cost. They drove for 40 minutes before Ethan felt comfortable stopping. He didn't take the highway. He stayed on secondary roads, moving north and then angling east, or choosing routes that ran through the kinds of towns that went dark after 9, small, quiet, unmonitored. He passed through 2 of them without slowing, reading the road signs and the layout of each one in the few seconds they gave him, filing information he might need later, and releasing what he wouldn't. In the first town, a gas station with its lights on. Noted. In the second, a sheriff's substation with 2 cruisers parked out front, both dark. Also noted. He didn't stop it either. Lillian rode in silence beside him. Not the silence of someone shut down, but the deliberate quiet of a person conserving themselves, holding their energy close, processing in the dark without spending words on it. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes tracked the road ahead without appearing to focus on anything specific. Ethan recognized the state. He'd seen it in people who had come through something and were quietly deciding what they were made of in its aftermath. She was working that out. He left her to it. Rex lay in the back with his chin on his paws, still watching the rear window, but his breathing had steadied into something closer to rest. He would sleep when Ethan slept. Until then, he kept watch. He had never needed to be asked to keep watch. The rain had thinned to a mist that clung to everything rather than falling, softening the reach of the headlights and making the road ahead look longer than it was. Ethan kept his speed even and unhurried. A van moving at normal speed on a back road at night was invisible. A van moving fast on a back road at night was a story that people remembered. He checked his mirrors every 90 seconds. Systematic. The same interval he'd used in motorcades, in exfiltrations, in the long stretches of movement between one dangerous place and another. The mirrors stayed clear. He pulled off finally at a rest area, one of the old state highway ones, a single low building with restrooms and a covered picnic area, surrounded by a thin tree line that caught the mist and held it. No fuel pumps, no staff, no cameras he could identify from the entrance. 2 other vehicles were parked at the far end, both dark, both still, a sedan and a pickup, their windshields fogged, suggesting they'd been there long enough for the engines to cool. Travelers sleeping, not a concern. He pulled into the middle of the lot, backed into a space that gave him a clean exit angle in 2 directions, and cut the engine. In the sudden quiet, the mist ticking softly against the roof of the van was the only sound. Then he took the recovered communications unit from his jacket. He'd been thinking about it for the last 40 minutes, not about what was on it, not yet, but about how to access it without triggering whatever remote wipe protocols a device like this likely carried. Government-grade equipment was built with fail-safes. Wrong sequence of inputs and the data collapsed. He'd seen it happen before in less controlled circumstances, and the results were permanent. He worked slowly, deliberately. Using a small flat tool from the emergency kit he kept behind the driver's seat, he opened the casing along its seam rather than through the interface. He wasn't going to talk to the device. He was going to look at what the device was connected to, physically, before it had a chance to talk back. Inside were 2 data chips and a circuit board running a proprietary OS. He recognized the architecture. He'd worked adjacent to this system in a different context years ago, in a capacity he still couldn't fully discuss. He knew which chip held the comms log and which held the operational data. He removed the operational chip, set the unit aside, and connected the chip to a small field reader he kept with his kit, the kind of tool that extracted raw data without negotiating with the software layer above it. It took 11 minutes. Most of that was waiting. When the reader finished, he scrolled through the output on its small display, reading quickly, taking in fragments and threading them together as he went. Lillian had turned in her seat to watch him, not speaking, no understanding that the silence was necessary. What he found was not a complete picture. It was pieces, fragments of operational communication stripped of their context headers, coordinates without labels, reference codes without accompanying files. But patterns emerged from fragments if you knew how to look for them. And Ethan had spent enough years looking for them that his mind assembled the shape of things without being prompted. A label appeared repeatedly throughout the comms log. 2 words, written in all capitals every time it appeared, as though whoever coined it believed the emphasis was load-bearing. Black Harbor. He stopped scrolling. The designation appeared in 14 separate entries across the log. Most were brief, cross-reference codes, acknowledgement signals, logistical markers. But 2 entries were longer. One was a timestamp cluster spanning 3 years, the earliest dated from over a decade ago. The other was a status notation. Terminated, archive pending, terminated. But the timestamp on the status notation was 18 months old, and the comms on this device were from last week. Something terminated 18 months ago was still generating operational communications last week. Ethan set the reader down on the seat between himself and Lillian and looked through the windshield at the misted dark beyond it. "What is it?" Lillian asked quietly. "The operation behind all of this has a name," he said. "Black Harbor. It's listed as terminated, but the communications on that device are current." He paused. "An operation doesn't generate current comms after it's been shut down, which means it wasn't shut down. It was relabeled, moved off the books, hidden under the termination record, and kept running under a different structure." Lillian was very still. "What kind of operation?" "I don't have enough to say for certain, but the architecture of it, the way the communications are structured, the level of equipment involved, the fact that it's been running for over a decade. This isn't a small program. This is something significant." He looked at her. "And your son was inside it." She absorbed that without looking away. "You said he was a silent handler." "That's the pattern that fits. Someone who moved assets, information, materials, access points, without appearing in the official record. A person who exists in the gaps of a program. Not a field operative, not an analyst, not an administrator. A handler. The connective tissue between pieces that aren't supposed to touch each other on paper." He paused. "Those people are valuable, and when they die, what they've safeguarded becomes a liability to the people running the program." "Because they can prove what was done," Lillian said quietly. "Because they can prove what was done," Ethan confirmed. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and he watched her process it. Not just the information, but what the information meant about Marcus. The quiet man who called every Sunday. The private man who played the room game and taught her to notice things. The man she had buried 14 months ago with questions she hadn't yet been able to ask out loud. She was asking them now, silently, in the pause between his words and whatever she would say next. He gave her the pause. He didn't rush it. "One of the coordinate sets in the data," Ethan said, more gently now, "connects to a storage location. Secure, remote, and based on the encryption level flagged around it. Significant. The kind of location you'd use to store something you couldn't afford to lose and couldn't afford to have found." He looked at the locket, barely visible beneath the collar of her coat. "The key Marcus gave you accesses something real, something at a specific location, and that location is in this data." She touched the locket with her fingertips, a small unconscious press of her palm against the place where it rested. He knew they'd come looking. He built this so that even if they came, they couldn't reach what he'd protected without the key. And he made sure the key was somewhere they'd never think to look. Ethan sat back slightly, on a chain around his mother's neck. Lillian's breath came out slowly, carrying the weight of something that had been held too long and was finally being released into words. "He kept me out of it as long as he could." "He did. And then he couldn't anymore." "No," Ethan said. "But he planned for that too. He gave you the means to finish what he started. He just couldn't tell you what it was, because the less you knew, the safer you were. Right up until the moment you weren't." She was quiet for a long moment. The mist fell on the roof of the van, and the trees at the lot's edge stood still and dark. When she looked up, her eyes were steady. Not tearless, but steady. the way people get when grief finds somewhere solid to anchor. "What did the data say about his death?" Ethan answered honestly. "Nothing directly, but the timestamp on his name in the operational log stops 14 months ago, and the escalation of retrieval activity begins within weeks of that date." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She understood what the sequence implied. She had understood it for 14 months, in the wordless, certain way that mothers understand things that no one will confirm for them. Hearing it framed in data and timestamps didn't change the fact. It only gave it a shape that the world outside her own mind could finally see. "All right," she said quietly. Not a question, not acceptance, just a decision being made about what came next. He reached for his phone. He typed a message to his associate, shorter than the previous ones, more direct, and sent it before he could second-guess the instinct. The reply came back in under 2 minutes. "Don't go to the facility alone. Wait for me. I can get you in clean." Ethan read it twice, then a third time. 3 hours ago, this man hadn't been able to give him anything concrete. Now he was offering to personally escort them into a classified storage facility. The shift was too clean, too convenient, too precisely timed to the moment Ethan had found the coordinates in the data. He thought about the warning his associate had given him earlier in the call. "Be very careful who you trust on this one." The man had been warning him about himself, whether he'd intended to or not. Ethan pocketed the phone without replying and started the engine. "We're going to the facility," he said. "Tonight. Before anyone else gets there first." Lillian didn't ask questions. She reached up, pressed her hand flat over the locket, and looked at the road ahead. "Then let's go," she said. The coordinates placed the facility in a pocket of rural industrial land about 60 miles northeast, accessible by 2 roads, set back from the nearest populated area by enough distance to be genuinely remote, without registering as conspicuously isolated. The kind of location that appeared on county maps as a decommissioned utility substation. The kind of location that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Ethan drove the longer route, approaching from the north where a low tree line ran along the perimeter's western edge. He stopped the van half a mile out, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for 60 seconds. He'd listening to the field around them settle. Nothing moved that wasn't wind. He told Lillian what they were doing in plain, specific terms, where they were going, what to expect at the outer perimeter, how to move through it, what sounds to listen for if something changed. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she understood, and she meant it. He had stopped being surprised by her composure several hours ago. It was simply who she was. They covered the rest of the distance on foot through the misted dark. The ground was soft from the earlier rain, which was good. Soft ground absorbed footfall and gave Rex clearer scent channels to work. The dog led the approach 10 feet ahead, working the ground and air with the unhurried efficiency Ethan had relied on in places far more dangerous than a field in rural America. Rex had worked in desert terrain, in mountain passages, in urban corridors so dense that navigation happened entirely by smell and sound. A wet field in the northeast was, by any measure, a comfortable operating environment for him. He found the outer perimeter fence without guidance, chain link, aged razor wire at the top, sections sagging with the particular exhaustion of infrastructure maintained at minimum functionality, and no more. Ethan found the gap at the concrete post, worked it open in under a minute, and they moved through cleanly. No noise, no lights, no sign from the building ahead that their approach had been registered. The facility itself was low and wide and built to be forgettable. A single-story structure of reinforced concrete, no windows, 2 visible entry points from their angle. The outer access door on the northern face was padlocked and coded, exactly as the satellite data had suggested. The secondary access point on the eastern face had no public record and no visible mechanism from the outside, just a smooth panel inset into the concrete wall, almost imperceptible unless you knew what you were looking for. They moved along the exterior wall in silence. The eastern door was set back into the wall, framed in steel, with no visible lock mechanism on the exterior, just a smooth panel to the right of the frame, roughly the size of a hardback book, inset flush with the concrete and showing only the faintest seam around its edges. Concealed. You wouldn't know it was there unless you knew to look. Ethan stepped aside and looked at Lillian. She reached up to the collar of her coat without hesitation, drew out the locket and opened it. The small key caught a thread of ambient light as she lifted it free. Her hands were steady. Whatever she felt standing here in the cold and the mist in front of a door her son had intended for her to find, she had decided what she was going to do with it before they ever left the van. She ran her fingers along the smooth panel until she found, near its lower right corner, a depression no wider than the blade of a thin key. She pressed the key in, a soft mechanical release, barely audible, and then the panel shifted inward by a centimeter before swinging open on a slow hydraulic hinge, revealing a keypad behind it. Ethan looked at it, then at Lillian. "Marcus's birthday," she said before he could ask. "Month, day, year. He made me memorize it years ago when I was starting to forget small things.
He said it was important I always knew it." She paused and something moved across her face. Not grief exactly, but the echo of it. "I never forgot." She entered the sequence. 8 digits, no hesitation. The door unsealed with a sound like pressure equalizing, a deep, soft exhalation of equalized air, and swung inward on its own weight, revealing a narrow corridor descending at a shallow angle into darkness below. Ethan was about to step forward when Rex stopped. Not dramatically. He simply planted his feet and refused the forward motion, his body angled sideways across the corridor entrance, his gaze directed not down into the passage below, but back along the direction they'd come, toward the tree line, toward the western perimeter. Ethan stilled immediately. He had learned over years to treat Rex's alerts as fact until proven otherwise. The dog didn't perform, he only ever reported. He put a hand on Lillian's arm, stopping her, and turned to look back into the dark. For a moment, nothing. Then a figure emerged from the tree line, walking toward them at an unhurried pace, hands visible and held slightly away from his body, moving with the deliberate openness of someone who wants to be seen approaching and has judged that full visibility is a safer posture than being discovered creeping. He stopped about 20 feet out and held position, letting Ethan have a full, unobstructed look at his face before taking another step forward. It was a practiced gesture, the kind of thing you did when you'd spent enough time in tense situations to understand that the most dangerous moment in any encounter was the one where the other person didn't know who you were. Ethan knew who he was, his associate, his old contact, the voice on the phone. The man was in his 60s, lean, gray-haired, wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt that was damp at the shoulders from crossing the field in the mist. His face was composed, not artificially calm in the way of someone forcing it, but the natural stillness of a person who had worn composure for so long that it had become their default expression. He raised one hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half offering, and then continued walking slowly toward them. "Ethan," he said. And his voice was exactly as it had been on the phone, measured, unhurried, carrying the particular confidence of someone who has navigated difficult conversations so many times that one more holds no special fear. "I'm glad you made it here safely." Ethan said nothing. He stood with his weight balanced evenly, hands loose at his sides, and waited. "I know how this looks," the man continued, closing the last of the distance between them at the same easy pace. "I told you not to come alone. You came anyway, which honestly I expected, so I came too." A faint smile,
the smile of shared history, of a dynamic that had run for years between two people who understood each other's habits. You never did take advice well. Rex had not moved. His feet were planted, his body angled across the corridor entrance, his eyes tracking the man with the complete, unblinking attention of an animal whose assessment was already final. He wasn't growling. He didn't need to. The message was in the stillness itself, the deliberate refusal to stand down that communicated without ambiguity that he had looked at this man and formed a conclusion about him. Ethan watched the dog and held the dissonance of it, the man's easy words pulling in one direction, Rex's entire posture pulling in another. "How did you find this location?" Ethan asked. "The same way you did," the man said simply. "The device you recovered from the building tonight gave me the coordinates. I've been tracking that unit since it went dark, which, by the way, tells me you know what you're doing." He paused. "I know how that sounds. But consider what I'm saying. If I wanted to stop you tonight, I have had a dozen better opportunities than standing in an open field and announcing myself." It was a reasonable argument. Ethan granted it its weight and held it separately from everything else, the way you hold something you're not ready to trust and not ready to discard. The man stopped a few feet from them and looked briefly at Lillian, a look that was careful, almost respectful, before returning his attention to Ethan. "Let me help you get through the inner system. I know this facility. I know what's down there. You need me for this part." He produced a small bypass unit from his jacket, compact, the kind used to navigate multi-layer security systems without triggering alert protocols. Ethan recognized the model, legitimate equipment, the kind issued for authorized access operations. "Let me go first," the man said. "I'll clear the way." Ethan stepped aside, just slightly, enough to create an opening toward the corridor entrance. The man moved to the threshold and stepped past Rex, who tracked him with his eyes and did not move. He stopped at the edge of the descending passage, his back to them, and he drew a breath, a small thing, almost nothing, the kind of breath most people wouldn't register. Ethan registered it. It was the breath of someone about to act on a decision they had already made well before this moment. The man turned. The weapon in his hand was pointed at Lillian. Not at Ethan, who was the physical threat in the space. Not at Rex, who was the unpredictable one. At Lillian, who stood 3 feet behind and to Ethan's right. It with no cover between her and the barrel, and who went completely still with a stillness that held no panic in it. Only clarity. Only the composed, clear-eyed recognition of someone who had known, in some deep and unspoken part of themselves, that this was always how the night was going to try to end. "I need the key," the man said. His voice had not changed, perfectly level, perfectly controlled. "And I need you to understand that I don't want to use this. I've been trying to end this cleanly for months. Every escalation tonight, the men at the diner, the team at the building, that was me attempting to resolve this before it reached the point where anyone got hurt. I managed this situation. I didn't design it." He looked at Lillian. "Give me the key. This ends here. You both go home." Ethan had not moved. But he was 4 feet to the left of the man, slightly behind the weapon's natural arc, running the geometry of it in real time. "You've been running the retrieval operation," Ethan said. "Managing it," the man said, with a slight corrective emphasis that suggested the distinction genuinely mattered to him. "Black Harbor doesn't belong to me. It belongs to people who've been waiting 14 months for Marcus Brooks's failsafe to surface. I've been holding them back, managing their impatience. That patience ran out 2 weeks ago, and tonight is the result." He paused. "I flagged your first message, yes. I had to report the contact. I didn't want to, for what that's worth." Ethan looked at him, at the familiar face, the steady hands, the expression that held something older and more complicated than guilt. "It's worth something," Ethan said. "Not enough." Rex moved. Not the explosive lunge of an animal unleashed, the quiet, inevitable forward motion of one whose patience with a situation has simply run its course. He came in below the weapon line without telegraphing the approach, and in the fraction of a second before the man could redirect the barrel, Ethan closed from the left, driving the gun arm up and outward, away from Lillian, rotating through the motion into a controlled disarm that used the man's own resistance as its engine. The weapon left his hand and struck the ground to the right of the doorframe. Rex had the man's wrist locked in that same instant, not with force intended to injure, but with the absolute immovable certainty of a grip that was simply not going to be broken. 3 seconds, beginning to end. The man went to the ground and stayed there. He didn't struggle. He lay on the damp concrete with his cheek against the cold surface and breathed steadily and looked up at Ethan with no rage in his face. Something more complicated than rage, something that had been building for a long time beneath the composed exterior and had now, with nowhere left to go, simply settled into stillness. The expression of a person who has ended up somewhere they didn't fully intend and is not entirely surprised to find themselves there. Rex released his hold, stepped back 2 paces, and settled into a position beside Lillian. The whole thing had taken less time than it took most people to process what had happened. "You really think opening that door makes you the hero?" the man said. His voice was still level, still almost conversational. As though they were finishing a long debate over something they had disagreed about for years. Ethan looked at him for a moment. At the familiar face that had, for a brief window tonight, seemed like the only ally available, at the careful, steady hands now secured behind his back. At the expression that held no real malice in it, just the hard residue of choices, made so gradually, over so many years, that each individual one had probably seemed manageable at the time. That was how it always worked in Ethan's experience. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to become the person who ends up zip-tied to a fence post in a field at midnight. It happened in increments, small compromises, practical decisions. Each one made in the language of necessity until necessity became the only language available. He crouched. I picked up the weapon from the ground and stood. "I think opening that door," he said quietly, "makes this a lot harder to bury." He secured the man to the concrete anchor post near the fence line, efficiently, without anger, the way you complete any other practical task, and then stood back and looked at Lillian. She hadn't moved from where she'd stood when the weapon was drawn. She was looking at the man on the ground with no vindication in her face, no satisfaction at the reversal of the moment, only the particular weight of someone watching the last unnamed piece of something long and terrible finally take its shape in the light. "He was working against Marcus for years," she said. It wasn't quite a question. The man on the ground said nothing. "Probably," Ethan said. "Or he was working around him. Sometimes that amounts to the same thing." Lillian turned to face the open door, the descending corridor, the cool air rising from below, the dark that held whatever Marcus had spent his quiet, careful life protecting. She stood at the threshold for a moment, the locket resting against her coat, the key that had opened this door still warm in her hand. "Then let's find out what he gave everything to protect," she said. Rex moved to her left side, steady and close, exactly where he always was when it mattered. Ethan moved to her right, and together they stepped through the door and descended into what Marcus Brooks had left behind. The corridor descended for maybe 30 feet before leveling into a wider space, and when the lights came on, triggered automatically by their presence. A low amber that built slowly rather than snapping on. What it revealed was not what Ethan had been picturing. He had been expecting something cold, clinical, the kind of facility that announced its own importance through steel and security. What he found instead was a room that looked like it had been built by a man who expected it to last, not impress. Sealed containers along the left wall, stacked with the careful logic of someone who thought about retrieval as much as storage. A central workstation, its screens dark, but its indicator lights blinking a slow, patient green. Filing architecture along the back wall, digital and physical both. The two systems running in parallel, the way careful people build redundancy into things they cannot afford to lose. And everything filmed in a fine layer of settled dust, except the workstation. Oh, the workstation was clean. Someone had been here not long ago. Ethan moved to the central station and touched the primary screen. It woke immediately. Not locked, not protected, which told him the password layer had already been handled by the key and code sequence at the door. Marcus had designed it that way deliberately. The hard lock was the entrance. Inside, everything was meant to be found. He pulled up the file directory while Lillian moved slowly along the sealed containers, reading the labels on each one with her hand trailing lightly behind her, the way you run your fingers along the spines of books in a library. What the directory showed was extensive, years of it. Operational logs, financial records, mock communications threads, all of it organized with the meticulous clarity of a man who had understood that the value of evidence was only as good as its legibility. Marcus had not just collected this. He had curated it, cross-referenced it, made it followable by someone who had never been inside the program. Someone like Lillian. Someone like a journalist, or an investigator, or a judge. Black Harbor, across its decade-plus of operation, was not a weapons program. It was not surveillance infrastructure in the traditional sense. It was a vault, but a vault that ran in reverse. Rather than storing things of value, it had been used to store things of liability. Evidence of covert financial operations. Records of deals between official offices and private interests that had no legal architecture to stand on. Suppressed incident reports. The kind of documentation that powerful people needed to not exist. Marcus had been its custodian. He had moved the material, maintained the access architecture, and ensured the system's integrity. And somewhere along the way, he had made copies of everything. A shadow archive of the shadow archive. He had hidden it in the only place he could guarantee would never be searched by the people he was protecting it from. This room. Ethan scrolled through the directory in silence. Each folder he opened confirmed the shape of it. The names, the dates, the chains of authorization on decisions that had never seen daylight. It was the kind of material that didn't just embarrass powerful people. It undid them. He became aware that Lillian had stopped moving. She was standing at the workstation beside him, looking at the screen. But not at the directory. She was looking at a file that had appeared in the upper left corner of the display, a thumbnail, video format, labeled with Marcus's name and a date from 2 years ago. A date Ethan recognized as being approximately 12 months before his death. He looked at her. She looked at the file. He clicked it open. The video was simple. A fixed camera, a plain background. A man sitting at a table. Marcus Brooks, younger looking than Ethan had imagined him, but carrying something in his face that aged him past his years. He had his mother's eyes, the same steadiness, the same capacity for looking at something difficult without looking away from it. He spoke directly to the camera. "Mom," he paused. And in that pause was everything. The love and the guilt and the long effort of keeping two lives separate that had clearly cost him more than he'd let on. "If you're seeing this, it means I failed to keep you out of it. I'm sorry for that. I tried." He looked down briefly, then back. "But I knew from the beginning that if anything happened to me, the only person I could trust to make sure this didn't disappear was you. Not because I wanted to put this on you. Because I know who you are. I've always known." Lillian made a sound, small, involuntary, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "What's in this room is the truth about a lot of things that a lot of people have worked very hard to make go away," Marcus continued. "I spent years being part of the system that kept it hidden, and I'm not proud of all of it. But I kept records. I kept everything, and I need it to matter. He straightened slightly. You always told me that the truth has a way of finding the light eventually. I'm counting on you being right about that. He looked at the camera one more time. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry it was this complicated. The video ended. Lillian stood without moving for a long moment, her hand still pressed to her mouth, her eyes on the dark screen where her son's face had been. Then she lowered her hand, and the expression that replaced the grief was not what Ethan expected. It wasn't devastation or collapse. It was something harder and quieter and far more resolute, the expression of a woman who had just been handed a purpose by the person she loved most. He wasn't asking me to carry this forever, she said softly. He was asking me to carry it far enough. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to add. Outside, above them, somewhere in the field, a sound traveled down through the concrete and reached them both at the same moment. The particular quality of engines, more than one, not passing, arriving. Ethan looked at the directory, then at the workstation's connectivity status. It showed a live uplink, satellite-based, maintained continuously regardless of whether anyone was present. Marcus had built the transmission infrastructure into the room itself. He had always intended for this moment. Ethan turned to Lillian. Do you want this hidden, or do you want the world to know what your son died protecting? She didn't hesitate, not for a single second. Marcus didn't give everything so this could stay buried, she said. Neither did I. Ethan initiated the transmission sequence. The system was already configured. Marcus had laid it out with the same methodical care as everything else in the room, a clear series of steps that required confirmation at each stage, as though he'd known that the person completing it might be doing so under pressure and needed the process to be unmistakable. 4 confirmation points, a list of preloaded recipient channels, secure journalism contacts, legal oversight bodies, international press organizations, none of them easily reachable by a domestic shutdown order, and a simple status bar at the top of the screen. It began to fill, slow, steady, the kind of progress that feels almost unbearable when you can hear boots on gravel and the sounds of a perimeter closing in. Ethan left the transmission running and moved to the corridor entrance. Rex was already there, positioned at the base of the ascending passage, body angled toward the door above. Ears forward, breathing controlled, waiting. Stay with the screen, Ethan told Lillian. If anything changes on that upload, if it stalls, if it disconnects, call out. I will, she said. She had pulled her chair to face the workstation directly, and her eyes were fixed on the status bar with the same focused calm she had brought to every other moment tonight. He took the corridor steps at a controlled pace and pushed the exterior door open by an inch, enough to see, not enough to present a silhouette. They had come in numbers this time. He counted 4 vehicles staged at different points around the facility's perimeter, headlights dark. Engines cutting as he watched. Figures moving in the field, organized, spread wide, approaching with the deliberate spacing of people who had done this before and expected resistance. A final push. They knew what was happening inside. He let the door close silently and returned to the base of the corridor. Rex looked at him. Not yet, Ethan said quietly. He took a position at the corridor's base, using the narrow passage as a natural bottleneck. Anyone entering would come down that slope one at a time, which removed their numerical advantage and reduced the encounter to something manageable. Rex took the opposite angle, pressed to the wall, invisible from anyone at the top of the ramp until they were already committed to the descent. The door above opened. A figure appeared at the top of the corridor. You assessing the darkness below, cautious as trained people are when they can't see what they're stepping into. He started down the slope. What happened next was controlled and deliberate and quick. Ethan moved from the wall the moment the figure cleared the threshold, using the corridor's confined geometry to his advantage, and the confrontation lasted seconds. The figure was secured. The next one hesitated at the top of the ramp, long enough for Rex to shift to a position that made the entrance an even less appealing prospect. Two more attempted entry. Neither made it to the bottom. Outside, the approach stalled. The teams regrouped, recalculated, and in recalculating, they gave the upload time. Ethan checked the status from the corridor base. 62%. He breathed. Rex settled beside him, shoulder against his leg, the way he did when he was telling Ethan he was still there and still ready and still fine. 78%. A radio crackled somewhere above. A voice, clipped, the words too muffled to make out but the tone clear. A signal, somewhere upstream, that the transmission was already reaching recipients. Already too late. He had seen that realization move through operations before. The moment when the math shifts and the people executing an order understand it can no longer achieve its purpose. The sounds above them changed. Engines restarted. Footsteps retreated across gravel. The tight, purposeful noise of a coordinated approach dissolved into the looser sounds of departure, not panicked, not chaotic, but unmistakably done. The cost-benefit of continuing had crossed a threshold that no one above had been willing to authorize. 94%. Lillian's voice came up the corridor, steady and clear. "It's almost done." He waited. The status bar completed. The transmission lock engaged, a quiet automatic sequence that sealed and authenticated the sent package across all recipient channels simultaneously and generated a time-stamped verification record that would be visible to every organization on the list. Irrevocable, distributed, already beyond the reach of the people who had spent 14 months trying to prevent it. Ethan walked back into the room. Lillian was still at the workstation. She had one hand resting flat on the surface beside the keyboard, and she was looking at the completed status bar with an expression that was not triumph. Something quieter than that, something that would take longer to fully arrive. Relief, maybe. Or the particular stillness of a weight finally set down. Rex walked to her and sat beside her chair without being asked. She reached down and rested her hand on his head. In the days that followed, the world began to move in the direction Marcus had intended. Investigations were opened. Names appeared in contexts that had never held them before. Organizations that had operated in the gaps of official record found those gaps closing. It was not fast. These things never were. But it was real, and the material Marcus had spent years preserving was at the center of it. Lillian returned to her life, which looked different now, not because the danger was entirely gone, but because the weight of carrying something alone was. She moved through her days with a lightness she hadn't had in over a year. The kind that comes not from the absence of grief, but from knowing the grief had been worth something. One afternoon, in the quiet of a weekday, she went to the cemetery. She stood at Marcus's headstone for a long while without speaking. The cemetery held its quiet the way such places do. Even the wind moved more gently between the stones. She had been afraid to come here for months, afraid that standing at this spot would finally break something in her that had been holding on by will alone. But it didn't. She stood and breathed and felt the grief the way you feel something familiar. Not as a blow, but as a presence. Something that had always been part of her and always would be. Then she reached up, unclasped the locket, and held it in her palm. The small worn oval, the brass softened to amber from years against her skin. She thought about the Christmas he'd given it to her, the way he'd pressed it into her hand and said, "Keep it close." She understood now what he'd meant. Not just the key, the fact of her, his trust in her. All of it. She set the locket at the base of the headstone, not as a burden laid down, as a thing completed. She stood a while longer in the pale afternoon light, then straightened her coat and walked back through the cemetery toward the gate. Ethan stood at a distance, near the tree line, Rex at his heel. He watched her go and didn't move until she had passed through the gate and disappeared from view. Then he turned away from the headstone, away from the quiet of the place, and started walking. No recognition waiting for him, no formal acknowledgement of what had happened or what he had done in the span of a single rainy night. That was fine. It had never been about that. He had stopped at a diner in the rain because Rex needed water. A woman had whispered something to him that changed the direction of an evening, and he had made a quiet decision in the space of a breath, and everything else had followed from that. Rex walked beside him, unhurried, ears relaxed, reading the wind off the open field beyond the cemetery wall with the calm attention of an animal that had done its job and knew it. She had only asked him to pretend for a moment. What he became for her changed everything. If someone trusted you with a secret that could cost you everything, would you carry it or would you walk away? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.